There's this strange sensation that arrives sometimes, isn't there? When everything in your life looks the same on the surface, the same rooms, the same routines, the same notifications lighting up your phone, but something underneath has shifted so profoundly that you can barely recognize the landscape of your own heart anymore. You might have noticed it in the quiet moments. The way your thoughts drift to someone who isn't there, not with the sharp ache of fresh loss, but with something more complicated. Something that tastes like understanding mixed with longing, like finally seeing a pattern you were too close to notice before. I'm sensing this energy around someone who stepped back from your world. Not dramatically. Not with doors slamming or words thrown like weapons. Just a gradual fading. A silence that settled in where conversation used to live. And if you're honest with yourself, part of you might have expected relief when they pulled away. Space to breathe. Freedom from the intensity of whatever was passing between you. But that isn't what arrived, is it? What came instead was this persistent presence in their absence. This feeling that they didn't actually leave because they wanted to. That something else was happening beneath the surface of their withdrawal, something they might not have even had language for at the time. Let me sit with this energy for a moment, because there's something here that wants to be understood differently than how you've been framing it. This is interesting. At first, the distance felt like rejection, didn't it? The classic story of someone losing interest, their feelings cooling, their attention wandering to something or someone new. That's the narrative we're taught to expect. The one that protects us by giving us a clear ending to mourn. But the energy I'm touching now tells a different story entirely. And I want you to consider whether this might resonate with something you've sensed but couldn't quite validate. This person didn't walk away because their feelings diminished. They walked away because their feelings became too large to contain within the container you both had built. Does that feel familiar? That sensation of someone looking at you with eyes full of something they couldn't name, something that seemed to scare them more than it comforted them? There's a quality to this connection that goes beyond the typical patterns of attraction or compatibility. I'm getting the sense that being near you activated something in this person that they weren't prepared to face. Parts of themselves they had carefully compartmentalized. Desires they had convinced themselves were impractical or too vulnerable to entertain. A capacity for feeling that felt dangerous to their carefully constructed sense of control. And here's where it gets truly fascinating, because I'm sensing that their departure wasn't an escape from you, it was an escape from what you reflected back to them. Have you ever had that experience? Where someone looks at you like you're showing them a version of themselves they weren't ready to meet. Where your presence becomes a mirror that reveals the gaps between who they are and who they sense they could be. The energy around this is complex. There's genuine care here. Respect, even. But also this undercurrent of overwhelm that I don't think they knew how to process. Because what was growing between you didn't fit into the neat categories they understood. It wasn't just friendship. It wasn't just romance in the conventional sense. It was something that demanded more authenticity than they had practiced, more openness than felt safe, more trust than their past experiences had taught them was wise. I'm hearing something like, I couldn't be what they needed me to be. But that isn't quite right, is it? Because you never asked them to be anything specific. You simply existed in your truth, and that truth asked questions of them they weren't ready to answer. There's a particular flavor to the night thoughts this person has about you. I'm sensing 3 a.m. contemplations, moments when the defenses come down and the mind stops its busy work of justification and explanation. In those hours, the narrative shifts. The reasons they gave themselves for stepping back start to feel thin, almost like excuses they know don't quite cover the territory of what actually happened. They think about conversations you had. Not the big dramatic ones, but the quiet exchanges where you saw something in them they thought they'd hidden well. The way you listened without trying to fix them. The way you held space for their contradictions instead of demanding consistency. And there's something else here that feels important. A recognition that you gave something they didn't know how to receive properly. Like being handed a gift in a language you haven't learned, knowing it's precious but not knowing how to hold it without damaging it. I'm getting the impression that this person is carrying a particular kind of guilt. Not the sharp guilt of having done something wrong, but the heavier, more persistent guilt of having been unable to show up fully for something that mattered. Of having recognized value and still being unable to align their actions with that recognition. Does that resonate? That sense that they knew, even as they were pulling away, that they were making a choice they might reconsider later? The transformation happening through this loss, both yours and theirs, isn't the simple story of healing from rejection. It's more nuanced than that. Because part of what you're integrating isn't just their absence, but the realization that their absence speaks to something about their own journey that has very little to do with your worth or their feelings for you. There's a pattern I'm noticing in how this energy wants to be understood. This person is learning something through the space they've created. Something about their own limitations, their own fears, their own capacity for intimacy. And that learning is happening in the background of their life, possibly without their full conscious participation yet. I'm sensing that the respect between you has actually deepened through this separation, even if it doesn't look like traditional reconciliation or closure. There's a way they hold you now in their consciousness that is more honest than how they held you when they were closer. The fantasy has dissolved, but something more grounded is trying to take its place. And here's what feels most significant in this moment: the soul-level imprint this connection left isn't going anywhere. You might have worried that time and distance would erase what was built between you, that absence would naturally lead to forgetting. But the energy suggests something almost opposite, that the distance has allowed the essence of what you shared to clarify, to become more visible against the background of everyday life rather than less. There's a particular sensation around how they remember you. Not as a person they used to know, but as a reference point for what's possible in human connection. A standard, almost, against which other interactions are measured and often found lacking. Have you noticed this in your own experience? The way certain people remain alive in your system even when they're not present, becoming part of your internal landscape in ways that transcend the practical details of the relationship? I'm getting the sense that this person is in a process of becoming. That who they were when they knew you and who they're growing into are different versions of themselves, and the gap between those versions is where a lot of their attention is currently focused. There's work happening there. Shadow work, integration, whatever language you prefer for the difficult business of becoming more whole. And you figure into that becoming in ways they may not fully articulate even to themselves. Not as a goal to return to, necessarily, but as evidence of what they're capable of feeling, what they're capable of recognizing in another person, what they might want to build in their life once they've built more capacity within themselves. The energy feels as if the universe is reminding you that not all meaningful connections are meant to be maintained in their original form. That some relationships serve their purpose through transformation rather than continuity. That absence can be a kind of presence, just shifted into a different frequency. I want to check in with something, because there's an emotional texture here that might be challenging to hold. Part of you might want this person to return, to recognize what they left, to bridge the gap they've created. And part of you might recognize that their return in the same form would simply recreate the same dynamics that made distance necessary in the first place. Both of those parts are valid. Both can coexist. You're not imagining the significance of what you shared, and you're also not wrong to sense that its significance doesn't automatically translate into a specific future shape. There's something about the timing of this that feels important to acknowledge. The universe seems to be suggesting that certain realizations can't be rushed, that this person needed to experience life without your influence in order to understand what your influence actually meant. That sometimes we have to lose the mirror to see what it was showing us. And in your own journey, there's a parallel process happening. The loss of their active presence has created space for you to recognize your own patterns of giving, your own relationship to availability and withdrawal, your own capacity to hold space for people who may not be ready to occupy it fully. I'm sensing that you've been questioning yourself in ways that aren't entirely fair. Wondering if you asked for too much, if your intensity was overwhelming, if your clarity about what you felt created pressure they couldn't handle. But the energy suggests that your transparency was actually a gift, even if it felt like too much to someone who was still learning to be transparent with themselves. There's a quality of integrity in how you showed up that is becoming clearer as time passes. The way you didn't play games, didn't hide your recognition of what was happening between you, didn't pretend to be less affected than you were. That integrity is part of what makes this connection continue to live in their awareness. It's what makes the comparison point so vivid when they encounter other relationships built on less honest foundations. I'm hearing something like, they needed to see that it was possible. That your way of being together demonstrated something about authentic connection that they hadn't experienced before, and that demonstration creates both longing and discomfort. Longing because they want more of it. Discomfort because they know they weren't able to match it with their own full participation. The night thoughts of you have a particular flavor I'm trying to name. There's sweetness in them, but also this edge of regret that isn't quite the same as wishing things had gone differently. It's more like recognizing that they weren't quite ready for what was being offered, and wondering if they will be, if they'll recognize readiness when it arrives, if they'll have the courage to act differently when they do. There's a question hanging in the energy around whether this separation is permanent or simply a long pause. And the honest answer seems to be that it depends on the work this person does in the space they've created. The transformation through loss isn't automatic, it requires engagement, reflection, willingness to be changed by what's been experienced rather than simply moving on to the next distraction. You might be sensing that they're not as far along in that work as you'd hoped, or that they're further along than you expected. Both observations are probably true at different moments. Growth isn't linear, and neither is the process of recognizing what we've left behind and what we want to carry forward. I'm getting the impression that there's communication that wants to happen but hasn't found its channel yet. Not necessarily the big conversation about what went wrong and what could be different, though that might be part of it. More like the ongoing, subtle communication that happens when two people remain energetically connected even across distance. The way you might think of them and find they've reached out, or feel a shift in your own emotional weather that later connects to something in their experience. This isn't about psychic connection in the supernatural sense, though I won't rule that out entirely. It's more about the reality that significant relationships create ripples that continue to move through our lives, showing up in dreams, in sudden memories, in the way certain songs or places or times of day carry specific emotional signatures. The respect born from walking away is different from the respect that exists in ongoing relationship. It has a quality of acknowledgement without possession, of appreciation without demand. I'm sensing that this person respects your choice to let them go, or your inability to stop them from going, more than they expected to. That they anticipated you might fight harder, demand more, make the leaving more difficult than you did. And in your relative grace, whether that grace was chosen or simply the only option available to you, they saw something else about your character. The way you can love without clinging, want without needing, feel deeply without making your feelings someone else's problem to solve. That might have been one of the most important lessons for them, actually. The demonstration that love doesn't have to be manipulative, that care doesn't have to be transactional, that presence doesn't have to be demanded to be genuine. That trust might have been more confronting than anger would have been. Because it asked them to consider whether they were being trustworthy with themselves, whether they were acting in alignment with their own deeper knowing or simply following the path of least resistance, the pattern of least vulnerability. The soul-level imprint shows up in small ways, doesn't it? The way you still sometimes expect to hear from them about certain things. The way their perspective remains alive in your internal conversations even when they're not there to offer it. The way other relationships feel somehow less saturated, less textured, even when they're more practically stable or socially approved. This isn't about comparison in the competitive sense. It's about the recognition that certain connections touch places in us that others don't reach, and that those places remain sensitive even when the connection that activated them changes form. I'm hearing that the universe wants you to know that this imprint is mutual. That you live in their awareness in ways they don't fully control, that your influence continues in their choices and perceptions even when they don't name it as such. The transformation through loss is happening for both of you, even if it's happening at different speeds and with different visible signs. There's something about the way this energy wants to close that feels important to honor. Not a closing of possibility, but a closing of this particular chapter of confusion and self-questioning. A recognition that you've understood enough, that continuing to analyze and interpret won't yield the clarity that time and organic unfolding will provide. You might notice that your own feelings about this person are shifting, becoming less urgent even if they remain significant. That the question of whether they'll return is slowly being replaced by the question of who you're becoming through having known them, through having lost their daily presence, through having continued your own growth regardless of their proximity. The respect that exists between you is a foundation, not a ceiling. It can support many different future shapes, including the shape of continued separation if that's what serves both of your highest paths. But it can also support reconnection, if and when that becomes possible from places of greater wholeness in both of you. What feels most important to leave you with is this: you weren't wrong about what you sensed between you. The intensity, the significance, the potential you recognized, it was real, even if the container for it proved unable to hold what wanted to grow. Your capacity to see clearly and feel deeply isn't a flaw that needs to be managed or minimized. It's a gift that will continue to serve you in connections that are ready to meet you at that level. And for this person, wherever they are in their own becoming, there's a part of them that knows this. That carries the imprint of being truly seen, that remembers what it felt like to be in the presence of someone who wasn't performing or protecting or waiting to be impressed. That knowledge will continue to work on them, even in your absence. Perhaps especially in your absence. Trust that the transformation through loss is serving its purpose, even when you can't see all the ways. Trust that the night thoughts of you continue, not as obsession but as recognition. Trust that the respect born from walking away is creating space for something more authentic to eventually grow, whether that growth brings you back together or simply allows you both to be more fully yourselves in whatever comes next. You are not imagining the significance of what you shared. You are not exaggerating the impact it had. And you are not foolish for continuing to hold space for it, even as you build a life that doesn't depend on its return. The story continues, as all stories do. And your role in this particular narrative has already been more transformative than you may ever fully know. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and trust your own knowing above all else. The cards can point to possibilities, but you are the one living your life, feeling your truth, walking your path. Honor that authority. It will guide you well.